Um, this webinar is being brought to you by Family Caregivers of BC, and my name is Janet McLean. I am the Education and Engagement Lead here at Family Caregivers, and we receive funding from our BC Ministry of Health to make these webinars available across the province and in this case the country. So we really appreciate that opportunity. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about Family Caregivers of BC, particularly for the caregivers who are joining us from BC. We are a nonprofit dedicated 100% to supporting family caregivers, and this year in July we will have been in existence for 30 years. We were the first of our kind in Canada, and currently there are 2 other provincial caregiving organizations, one in Nova Scotia and one in Alberta. But we're hoping that Ontario is going to come on board soon, and we're just really grateful that we have the opportunity to provide this kind of support in BC, and we've been doing this provincially since 2010. This is a busy slide, and what I would really encourage those of you who are interested to do is go to our website, which the address for that is at the bottom of this slide, so it's easy, www.familycaregiversbc.ca. We have 3 pillars of support. The first one is caregiver support, and if you don't already know, we have a caregiver support line that you can call toll-free from anywhere in BC. The number is provided here. Again, it's on our website. If you call us during business hours, Monday through Friday, we have people here who will talk to you and do their best to help you with whatever situation you're facing. And you know, whether that's just getting having someone listen to you, that's a really big part of what we do, but we also will help you navigate the healthcare system. We will provide you with information and referral to resources, both resources that we have and resources in your community. We also have a service for people who are really in a tough spot. We have a coaching service where we offer a bit more of an in-depth review of your situation and some ongoing contact, and we will refer you to that service if we think that's appropriate through our call line. We also have lots of resources on our website. So again, if you go onto our website, we have a quarterly newsletter that you can subscribe to, either hard copy or by email. And if you subscribe by email, you will get a monthly bulletin with all kinds of information about things that are happening across the province that might be of interest to you. And last but not least, you know, we help to develop support groups across the province. We run support groups on Vancouver Island, and we help to train support group facilitators and develop support groups wherever we can in other communities. And I can't say enough about the value of making in-person contact with other people going through the same thing. It's just been proven over and over that that's the best kind of support you can receive as a caregiver. We also encourage caregivers who might feel that they're willing to be representative to let us know, and we take caregivers to events in Vancouver, on the island, even nationally. Our goal is to make sure that the caregiver voice is represented in healthcare planning and delivery, and so we are becoming known for that and often get requests to have caregivers attend different types of planning events and focus groups and review materials. So if that's something you're interested in, there's a place on our website you can go and sign up and let us know, or just call us. So just a little bit of a plug for us. You can come back and look at our. I'm just thrilled to introduce Jean, who you can see in the upper left-hand corner of your screen. Jean has such an interesting background, from being a teacher to a government executive and a Protestant minister, with a Bachelor of Arts and a Master's of Divinity. And I've read your book cover to cover, Jean. I'm so impressed with what you did, and have to say that her biggest qualification for this book is the fact that she was a caregiver for her mom. And so from that perspective, Jean felt that this was a real missing in terms of information for caregivers who are on that journey at end of life. There is an awful lot that happens, and this book is a really wonderful way of bringing all of that together. So tonight, Jean is going to present on her experience and what she learned. And Jean, I'm going to just turn it over to you now. So I'm just going to change the layout now so that we bring up Jean's presentation. And just a note before we get started, you will see on the bottom of your screen that there are 2 documents there for download. One of them is the actual PowerPoint from tonight, so you won't need to take notes furiously. You can just download that onto your own computer. And also, Jean wrote an article for our winter issue of our newsletter, and so that's also in our newsletter, which is available on our website. So those 2 documents are available for upload tonight. And if you miss that opportunity tonight, don't worry, because we record this webinar. It will be posted on our website along with these documents. So Jean, thank you so much for making this a possibility, and I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Thank you so much for a wonderful introduction. And again, just want to acknowledge the important role that the family caregivers of BC play in supporting caregivers. So thank you for this opportunity. I'd like to start our time together this evening by acknowledging that the topic we're about to talk about can be very challenging, even though death is a natural part of life. And so to start with, I'd like to ask you to think about the beginning of life, the beginning of life's journey, and how there's a book, for example, called What to Expect When You're Expecting. And it talks about all the practical things. You're bringing a new life into the world, emotions, the growth of a baby, excitement, support groups, education. But when our minds turn to the end of life's journey, somehow the conversations become more difficult. And the idea of education and training seems a bit foreign. I'm hoping that tonight will be a first step for you as a caregiver in making some of those end-of-life conversations a little easier. I understand that some of you may not have access to the PowerPoint, and so I will try my best to reference some of the points that are referenced on the slides that I'll be reviewing with you this evening. There are 4 learning objectives that came to mind as I was preparing for this evening. The first one is starting with reflecting on the impact of illness on us as caregivers. We so quickly think and see the impact of illness on the person we're caring for, but illness also has an impact on us, and so I thought it was important for us to start our conversation there. I would also like us to think about some of the end-of-life considerations and decisions that are required after death. And again, some of those topics can be difficult to talk about. And finally, I do want to flag for you some of the resources that are available, including the number of resources that are available on the Family Caregivers website. You may find some of the topics this evening a bit challenging, and that's okay. I think part of the journey as caregivers is to reflect on the impact of illness on you. If you find a topic a little too challenging to think through this evening, come back to it. That's the beauty of the Family Caregivers having the webinars recorded. Also wanted to flag that our conversation this evening is very much in alignment with the priorities of the Family Caregivers of BC, the concepts of providing support, informing and educating, and again acknowledging the important role of caregivers. Our webinar tonight, as Janet mentioned, is based on a book I wrote called Someone I Love is Dying. It's a very hard title. The idea behind the book is very much what are all those practical things you need to think about both before and after someone you love dies. The book is based on my experience, as Janet mentioned, for caring for my mother. When I was walking alongside her on her end-of-life journey, I desperately wanted some resources. So I went to the bookstores and found lots of books on death and dying, on grief and grieving, but very few resources that walked me through the practical things I needed to think about in the time that remained and then after her death. So as I reflected on her journey, my mother's journey, I wanted to find a way to make it easier for people that were in my circumstance, a caregiver, finding a way to make it easier for them to think through those decisions. To be honest, it took me a while to be ready to share my experience. And I think that's also part of the journey, understanding what you're feeling and your readiness, and perhaps your need for support as well.
Jean, we've had one of the participants say that they're finding it a little bit hard to hear you, so is there a way you could turn up your volume?
I've moved my phone a little closer. Is that a little better?
I think I can hear you a bit more clearly, but...
Okay, thank you for flagging that. I do have an extra phone here just in case there's a phone issue, so please do let me know. As we begin our conversation tonight, I did want to flag that what we're about to talk about is a replacement or substitute for, and I'm just going to switch phones here.
You might have to turn that one off.
Oh, geez, is that a little better?
Yeah, I think it is. Let's give this one a go.
I'm so sorry.
That's all right.
The information tonight isn't meant to be a substitute for professional advice, so talking to a doctor, a lawyer, an accountant, etc., but it is a starting point. So as we walk through the slides for this evening, you're going to hear different parts of my professional background coming out. The learning objectives are part of my training as a teacher. The checklists and tasks, the things that need to be done, are part of my focus as a government executive with the Government of BC on getting things done. And finally, concepts around emotional and spiritual well-being and planning and leading funerals are part of my experience as a Protestant minister. In thinking about our time this evening, I thought it might be helpful for us to divide the conversation into two parts. The first one is the time that remains, focusing on the most important things, some of those difficult conversations that are so important to have while your loved one is still with you. And then after a loved one passes, what happens next? How do you honor them after death? I do also want to flag that you may, on occasion, notice some emotions still coming out as I share my journey. Again, that's part of the journey of a caregiver. The loss is still with me, but the way I choose to respond to it is different. I choose to try and help others to cope with their journey as well. Starting our conversation this evening with the time that remains, there is a quote that really caught my attention. It says, "Time is the most valuable thing a man can spend." It's a quote by a Greek author named Diogenes Laertius. And it was a real reminder for me. I don't know how much. So when I learned that my mother had a very limited amount of time, it forced me to think about what's most important to me and to make sure that I was doing it now, not waiting. As we turn our minds to the time that remains, I thought there were 5 important areas for us to talk about. The first one being where to begin. Your loved one gets a diagnosis that there's a terminal illness. What do you do next? As you may be aware, there's a significant amount of medical care and appointments that are involved, and so there were a number of lessons that I learned in caring for my mother that I wanted to share with you. There are also a number of important documents and conversations around final wishes and advanced directives that were so important, and in some cases, conversations that I wish I had had. And finally, conversations around advanced planning for arrangements after death. So, where to begin? It can be very difficult to come to terms with information that your loved one has been diagnosed with a terminal illness or life-threatening illness. And one of the things that often occurs is anticipatory grief, intense sorrow knowing that someone you love is going to die. Some of the things that you as a caregiver may be feeling: shock or numbness, anxiety and fear, anger or sadness about why this is happening. In some cases, denial or an unwillingness to believe that the diagnosis is correct. In some cases, you may feel like an inability to cope with life. And that's something that I remember vividly. Basic things like preparing meals or cleaning the kitchen became very difficult. And finally, a sense of despair. These are some of the physical and emotional impacts that you and your family and friends may be feeling. And I thought it was important to start our evening by taking a moment to reflect on whether that's some of what you're experiencing right now. Some of the things that you may consider in order to take care of yourself. On slide number 4, there's a graphic around self-care. If you can care for yourself, you will be in a better position to care for your loved one. So at the top of the graphic is the concept of regular exercise, finding a way to relieve your stress. Diet is something that can become challenging as you're caring for your loved one. It's easy to go to your comfort foods. For me, that would be chocolate. But having healthy snacks readily available is something that can help you stay healthier and take care of yourself. Doing some of your favorite things, whether it's a walk, going for coffee with friends, meditating, things that help you remain in touch with the things that you value, the things that help you feel good. Basic things like dental and medical appointments, counseling, or reaching out to family and friends for support. And I have a few suggestions for things that I found helpful in my journey that you may want to suggest to some of your family and friends.
So, Jean, we're still getting a bit of feedback that the volume is a bit low. I'm wondering if you could speak more directly into your phone, or not quite sure what we can do about this.
Okay, so I've moved my phone right under my mouse. I'm hoping that's a little, and perhaps Alex can confirm.
I think that's better. Okay. Sorry about this. It just takes a bit of adjustment.
No worries. We've paused for a moment to reflect on what we or what you as a caregiver may be feeling. But I also wanted us to think for a moment about what your loved one may be feeling. One of the common approaches to dealing with death is an approach that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross developed, and she identified 5 stages identified with death and dying. The idea of, at first, someone denying that they were dying, then maybe going through anger and bargaining, depression, and then finally acceptance. Those stages aren't necessarily in linear order. Sometimes people go back and forth between them, but there are also some more recent thinking just about how people experience death and the fact that different people process a diagnosis of terminal illness in very different ways. And for some, that concept of a yearning to belong or the need to be loved becomes particularly important at the end of life. Open communication is something that I reflected on a lot as I was walking alongside my mother. And so just some things to think about as you are a caregiver alongside your loved one. Sometimes just basic things like touch, holding someone's hand, an embrace can help deal with feelings of isolation. Even just being in the same room, knowing that you're there. Active listening is something else that if someone wants to talk about how they're feeling and how they're working through their diagnosis of a terminal illness, being there to actively listen. I found humor and favorite things was really important for my mother. Taking time to just watch a movie, reflect on things that make us happy or bring us joy. Favorite activities are also something to think about for your loved one, whether it's music or books or just spending time together. I did want to come back to that concept of support from family and friends. Some of the things that you may wish to consider reaching out to your family and friends about, things like asking them to pick up groceries or dropping off prepared meals, Sometimes it can feel, as I mentioned, overwhelming with all of the activities and decisions that you're involved in supporting your loved one. Sometimes basic meals can be very helpful. Vehicle maintenance or house maintenance, as you're focusing on your loved one, those are sometimes things that fall by the wayside. So if a friend can arrange for an oil change, or for people in Victoria more recently, shoveling snow, those are things that can be very helpful. And finally, that concept of self-care and pampering. A friend may wish to give you a gift certificate for a massage, or a manicure, something to help you take care of yourself. Medical care is something that was a huge responsibility when I was walking alongside my mother. And so what you'll find on slide number 7 of the deck is just some considerations or activities that caregivers are often involved in, and some suggestions around resources or tools to consider. So for example, you may be dealing with a lot of medical staff, so how do you communicate effectively with them? And one of the suggestions that I had was to think about questions or concerns in advance of your meetings. Sometimes when you're in the middle of the meeting, it's hard to think about all those things that you wish you'd ask them. As you're going to these meetings, and hopefully you are able to attend the medical appointments with your loved one, consider taking notes or writing summaries of those discussions. Some of the things that you hear may be difficult to process, and in some cases you may not want to hear them. Sometimes it's easier to simply write them down and come back to them later. In some cases, medical professionals will allow you to record the conversations using a cell phone, but of course always ask first. That's one way of making sure that you heard correctly what they were saying. Another suggestion is to keep a contact list, or just to purchase a business card holder from a local office supply store. In my mother's case, there were a huge number of specialists that we were dealing with, and I found it hard to remember their names and contact numbers, let alone their area of specialty. And so keeping those business cards or that contact list was a helpful way to organize the specialists. There are often a lot of medical appointments, and so making sure that you don't double book appointments. Simple things like a wallet-sized planner, a small calendar, or the calendar function in a cell phone can be very helpful. Administering medication was an important part of my role in supporting my mother. And so often there are medication schedules that community health nurses will provide, or medication organizers that you can get from local pharmacies to help you remember the amounts and dosages and timing of medication that needs to be administered. Monitoring health changes was also important. As you're administering the medication, are there interactions? Is there illness that occurs when a certain medication is taken? What time of day does that happen? And so I found it helpful to track the interactions or effects of the medication that my mother was taking. And then finally, considering medical care options, and here again I'll be very candid. Part of my role in caring for my mother was changing her bandages after surgery, and that was something very difficult to see the physical impacts of the surgery on my mother. And so you may want to pause for a moment and just reflect on your abilities to either care for the bandages, or do you need assistance from a home care nurse, or do you need to be considering other care options like longer-term care facilities, or eventually a hospice facility. One final comment before we leave this particular slide. Sometimes emotions can be very strong when someone you love is dying. And I would encourage you to first reflect on it and acknowledge those emotions, and ideally not to direct them at medical staff, but to recognize what's happening within you and to find constructive ways to deal with that frustration or that anger. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in the second part of our conversation this evening. As we turn our minds now to important documents, ideally This is an important conversation to have in the time that remains. If you are able to locate important documents and talk with your loved one about their wishes after death, it's so much easier to honor them and to make sure that their wishes are carried out. There are some basic pieces of information or documents that are very helpful. So, for example, a starting point is a list of key contacts. So that might be the person's lawyer or accountant, the executor of their will. So that's the person who's responsible for carrying out their wishes. Bankers, key friends, a minister. Having that list prepared in advance can make things so much easier later on. Some of the key identification papers include things like a driver's license, a birth certificate, or a marriage certificate. Financial information might include things like bank accounts, life insurance, but also investments like savings bonds, education savings plans, and personal assets. Are there important items that are valuable to your loved one? It might be jewelry or art. It might be high-end sports equipment. Those are conversations that it's important to have with your loved one. Real estate and property is also part of that. And ideally, if you're able to talk with them about planning for their estate. So that's the concept of what do they own, what are their debts, and what do they want to happen after they pass away. And that includes, those special items. Where do they want them to be distributed? How do they want them to be distributed? And again, that conversation was very difficult to have with my mom. By the time she was turning her mind to estate planning and things that were special to her, she was very tired, and she didn't want to talk about it. So if you're able to have those conversations earlier, it's always helpful and makes things easier. Final wishes and advance directives are another area to think about in order to make things easier for those that remain after your loved one passes, but also easier to honor your loved one's wishes. Before we talk about advance directives, I wanted to encourage you to reflect for a moment on preserving memories. This is one of my key lessons learned. There were so many things happening in supporting my mother. As I mentioned, medical appointments and just general care. I didn't think about her memories, asking her about some of her favorite things, collecting some of her favorite photos, maybe providing a journal so that she could write down some of her thoughts. Some of the ways that people have preserved memories include audio recordings or video recordings. But again, that concept of respectfulness. Illness can take a toll on the physical appearance of your loved one, and so they may not want to be videotaped, but an audio tape will at least allow you to preserve the sound of their voice. One final thought on preserving memories before we move on in the rest of the slide. A key area that I wish I'd explored more was medical history. My mother died of breast cancer, and I'm not sure that she knew the extent of the history of cancer, and in particular breast cancer in her family. And so that's a key consideration for me and for my daughter. So if you have the opportunity to talk with your loved one about their medical history, I would strongly encourage you to do so. As we consider the rest of slide number 9, you'll notice that there's a very challenging question on that slide. Who will decide if you can't? That question is also part of the end-of-life journey. And in some cases, your loved one may get to the point where they are no longer able to decide about their health care. And that's where advance directives come in. Advance directives are legal documents that allow a person to specify their decisions about accepting or refusing health care. And that includes life-supporting health care. So a do not resuscitate order would be an example of a choice that someone could make as part of an advance directive. In some jurisdictions, like Ontario, they call that particular type of legal document a healthcare power of attorney. but in BC we use the term representation agreement. And basically it's a document that allows you to name a person to make personal decisions for you and some healthcare decisions depending on the nature of the agreement that you choose. I wanted to flag that the Ministry of Health in BC has an excellent online planning guide for advanced directives, and it's called My Voice, Expressing My Wishes for Future Healthcare Treatment. And I would strongly encourage you to take a look at that resource. It's a great document for thinking through your values and beliefs and your final wishes. The final two bullets on this particular slide encourage you to think about talking with your loved one about a will. And I mentioned a little bit already about that concept of what does your loved one own and what do they want to happen with their assets after death. Do they want to give certain items, personal items, to a charity, to a family member, to a best friend? If there are children, has a guardian been appointed? And who will be responsible for caring for their wishes, executing their wishes in the will? That role is called an executor. One consideration to flag for you, make sure that if your loved one does create a will, that they put it in a place that's easily accessible. And many people choose to make a copy of their will and share it with the executor or with family members to make that easier. A final consideration is organ donation, organ tissue, or body donation. And in BC, I wanted to flag that there's a website by BC Transplant that talks about the steps to go through if you choose to donate organs, tissues, or your body. And in particular, there was a quote that they have on one of their the slides on their website. It says, "One organ donor can save up to 8 lives." So definitely something to consider. There is a process to work through if your loved one chooses to donate organ, tissues, or their body. And that process can be undertaken using a paper form or online as well. But it's important to have those conversations with your loved ones so that when the time comes, you're aware of what your loved one's wishes are. Advanced planning for arrangements after death. Again, a difficult topic. If you have the opportunity or if your loved one is in a place where they're able to talk about some of these arrangements, there are a variety of options to choose from, considerations to think through. One is a traditional burial, and for a long time that was most common. It might involve embalming fluid, caskets, a burial in the ground. But what you'll see in the graphic on the slide is an eco-friendly burial option. It's a biodegradable natural wicker container. And so there's no embalming fluid involved, and the body is often wrapped in natural fabric, such as hemp cloth. And instead of a gravestone, trees, shrubs, or flowers are used to mark the location of the grave. So certainly one of the options that's becoming more popular. There are also a couple of other options. Permission is a little bit of an unusual word, but it was a process that was invented in Sweden, and that's where a body is freeze-dried and then reduced to fine powder that decomposes naturally. And then cremation, which involves intense heat. And bone fragments are crushed or ground into ashes. There are different costs associated with each of these options, and so again, if you're able to have those conversations with your loved one about what their wishes are. Other considerations for advanced planning include whether your loved one wants a service or not. Often the service is called a funeral, and for some, a funeral is a very formal affair in a church or a funeral home. But in my experience, celebration of life or memorial service is becoming much more popular. So for example, a couple of years ago, the husband of a friend was a big motorcycle driver, and so they rented an auditorium or a community hall and brought his motorcycle in and featured it prominently in the middle of the community hall. And people shared stories of his love for motorcycles. Another memorial service that I participated in, a friend was very active in local social groups. And so people had an opportunity to see pictures of the various groups that she was involved in and reflect on their relationship with the person who had passed away. So there are a number of different options to consider. A committal service is a service that is sometimes followed from either a traditional funeral or a celebration of life, and that's what you'll see in the slide here. There's a casket and there are flowers on top, and what I've done before is invite people attending this service at the graveside to take a flower and share a favorite memory with of their loved one, and then place the flower on the casket before it's lowered. You'll notice in this picture that there are also cards that have been placed there. It's an opportunity for those that remain to share a favorite memory or express emotion about their journey of loss. Some may also, in talking with your loved one, may choose not to have a service. And so, again, the importance of understanding whether your loved one wishes to have a service or if they want to offer the option of a choice of service to those that are left behind. So, we've talked about a number of considerations in the time that remains, and some of them can weigh very heavily. What happens next? You've done your best to have those conversations to respect where your loved one is at. When death occurs, what are some of those things that you need to think about? What about funeral arrangements, working through grief and grieving, and settling the estate? It's interesting that even though death is a natural part of life, it's still difficult when it finally happens, even though you've been preparing for it. So when death occurs, what happens to the body? This was another one of my lessons learned. Some people feel that once their loved one has passed, that the body needs to be removed immediately. If you wish to spend more time with your loved one once they have passed, that is often an option. A friend of mine passed away 2 years ago, and the hospital was able to hold her body so that friends who were out of town were able to get in town and pay their respects. That's not always the case depending on the location where your loved one passes away, but it's definitely something to think about. Once your loved one passes, there are some physical changes that happen to their body, and so things that you may wish to think about include inserting dentures back into the mouth, closing their eyes, in particular jewelry. If there is some jewelry that you wish to hang on to, now is the time to remove it. And you may find that to be a difficult thing. If you wish for some of the jewelry to remain with them, you may consider taping it onto their finger so that the jewelry doesn't fall off. And finally, wigs or other items that you want to accompany the body, now would be the time to think about those things. Key contacts. Ideally, you've had time to talk with your loved one about some of those key people to contact after they pass. One of the suggestions that I have is you may wish to consider asking a friend or a relative to take on that role of phoning those key contacts, because often emotions are very strong immediately after you've lost a loved one. Again, some of the key contacts to connect with might be the funeral director, close friends, a family doctor, or immediate family members. The body itself will be, if your loved one passes away in a hospital or a care home, they will reach out to either the funeral home that you've made arrangements with, or if your loved one has arranged for body donation, it will be important to let the doctors, your family doctors, know to prepare for those arrangements so that the body can be donated, either tissues or whole body. And then there is a death registration process that needs to take place. Normally, the medical certificate of death is completed by a doctor or a local coroner. That creates a legal record of death. But there's also the registration of the death that needs to happen with local authorities. And so in BC, that's the Vital Statistics Agency. I did also want to mention, though, that funeral homes may issue a proof of death certificate. And that's something that you may want to consider if your local Vital Statistics Agency is running behind or has quite a backlog in issuing those death certificates. So funeral arrangements. One of my memories was that immediately after my mother passed, I went to one of the funeral homes in town that we'd made preliminary arrangements with, and I was very emotional. So I would strongly encourage you to take a friend or a family member with you to help you think through some of those choices, particularly if your loved one didn't specify any particular arrangements before death. It can be very challenging to make some of the decisions around caskets and costs and services. And so, it's easier if you've had an opportunity to have some of those conversations in advance or to take a trusted friend with you. I did want to talk with you briefly about funeral costs and some of the basic categories of costs that you will likely encounter. One of the key or core costs is a professional service fee. And that's a fee that covers all of the services related to the funeral home director, transportation of the body to the funeral home, filling out forms, etc. And that fee is not optional. There are, however, some additional fees that are optional. One of those is transportation costs if you choose to have a limousine or a hearse. If you choose to hold a viewing, some people take the casket to a funeral home or a church and give loved ones an opportunity to actually view the body of the person who's passed away. A third category of expenses is cash disbursements. And those are things that you may ask the funeral home to purchase for you, such as flowers or catering or a musician. I think the bottom line is that funerals can be very expensive. And so understanding what was important to your loved one and understanding what's important to those that remain will help you in making some of those decisions. I've included a couple of suggestions or considerations around planning a funeral service, but I'm going to share those with you in just a moment and jump to the writing an obituary consideration. Often loved ones will consider, or caregivers will write an obituary and include it in a newspaper. And one of the things that I've seen frequently lately is online obituaries. So a newspaper may feature the obituary and give readers an opportunity to offer their condolences online. And it's a wonderful way to have an online record of the feedback from people perhaps across the country who knew your loved one, but that are not able to attend a service if you're holding one. Some of the basic pieces of information that are included in an obituary are a general introduction, an identification of the next of kin or relatives, an overview of their life, and then information on funeral arrangements. And in some cases, rather than funeral arrangements, people may request donations to a favorite cause. And so again, the importance of understanding your loved one's wishes. Slide 15 has just a couple of considerations that you may want to reflect on if you choose to hold a funeral service or a memorial service. And I'm not going to go through each of them separately, but rather just flag a couple of considerations for you. Again, that concept of location. It doesn't have to be a church or a funeral home. Some of the funerals or services that I've been to recently have included community halls or a favorite club. And in one case, I led a funeral by the ocean because that was what was important to those that remained. A eulogy is often an overview of a person's life. And as I mentioned, one of my friends who passed away a couple of years ago was very active in a number of clubs. And so instead of a formal eulogy, there were a variety of people that stood up and shared their favorite memories of the various clubs that my friend was involved in: scuba diving, food and wine, a variety of clubs. And that helped people to celebrate her life, and it was important to the family that the event be a celebration rather than a somber event. Finally, again, just that concept that instead of flowers, if you and or your loved one valued a particular charity or wanted to recognize a health provider who was particularly helpful in their end-of-life journey, that would be something to flag in the obituary and potentially also flag it for those who may attend whatever service you choose to hold. Grief and grieving. We talked a little bit at the beginning of our time together this evening about how you may be feeling about the diagnosis of your loved one having a terminal illness. There are also physical effects on you once your loved one passes. And I wanted to reflect for just a minute on some of those key effects that you may end up experiencing or may have already experienced. Exhaustion was one of the ones I remember, both physical and emotional. So many things happening, so many emotions that you're trying to process. Distraction and waves of sadness, and a number of physical symptoms. Sleeping may be a challenge. Headaches, shakiness, loss of appetite, physical and emotional effects from your loss. One of the things to watch for is if some of those effects end up lasting for a long time. So if, for example, you find that you are ignoring people, avoiding interactions, you're not taking care of yourself, there's prolonged denial about what happened. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the book called The Year of Magical Thinking. There was a play made about it, and it's a story of a woman who lost her husband to a heart attack and how it took her a year to process that loss. We each process loss in different ways, and it's important to watch for signs of grief that endure and that are not healthy. Some of the other signs, just to flag for you, self-destructive thoughts, depression, or self-medication through alcohol or drugs. Before we think about helping children cope with grief, I did want to turn your attention to the bullets on the right side of slide number 16, coping with grief, and just some suggestions on things you may want to think about to help you work through your experience of loss. And one of the ones that can be very helpful is talking. And Janet mentioned the importance of personal interaction and talking at the beginning of our time together this evening. Spiritual comfort, whether it's religious traditions or prayer or meditation, may help with grief. Seeking out support groups, and Janet also mentioned the importance of some of the support groups that are available through family caregivers. Considering counseling, a therapist or a grief counselor. Journaling is something that I found very helpful, writing down and trying to process my emotions and reflecting on my journey of loss. You may find it helpful to preserve some of your favorite memories, a way of honoring your loved one and having a place to go to, a book to go to celebrate and to remember. And again, that importance of self-care, sleeping, eating properly, exercising. Before we leave this slide, I did want to flag that children also experience grief. And for some reason in our society, it often seems that we avoid talking with them about grief, even though they see death sometimes more frequently than we imagine, whether it's the death of a fish or a dead bird on the road. And so I think part of the challenge in helping children cope with grief is speaking to them at a level that they're able to understand, talking with them and giving them an opportunity to ask, where is Grandma or Grandpa? Where did they go? Why can't I see them anymore? Reassuring them that you are still there, that you are with them, and sometimes regular routines is part of helping them to cope and move forward. Allowing them to express grief is also helpful. And in my book, I've referenced a couple of different books to help children deal with grief. And I brought two of them for those of you who have video. One of them is called Lifetimes, The Beautiful Way to Explain Death to Children. And it talks about different animals and butterflies and their life experience from birth to death. The second book is called When Dinosaurs Die. And while the picture may be a bit kitschy, it is very simple, includes very simple explanations about how children are feeling and asking questions and trying to process and understand death. So we've talked about quite a number of things. The final key concept before we move to a time of questions is around settling the estate. And I talked a little bit earlier about the importance of understanding your loved one's wishes, asking them what they want to happen with their belongings, their assets, their property. Do they have a favorite charity? If there is no will, local laws determine what happens to your loved one's assets. And so if at all possible, I would really encourage you to have a conversation about what their wishes are before death so that you can honor them. Often, if there is no will, it can end up being more expensive to distribute their assets, to administer their estate, and what happens may not be consistent with the wishes of your loved one. If there is a will, administering the will involves a number of aspects, including probate. And probate, in very general terms, is a legal process for reviewing a will to make sure that it's valid and authentic, and to confirm the authority of the person who's listed in it to execute the will. And so that person responsible for executing the will is called the executor. And they have a number of important roles to undertake, including locating important documents, and hopefully you've had some of those conversations before death so that you know where the will is, where investments are, where special assets are. So dealing with financial affairs, paying any debts for the estate, filing tax returns, and distributing assets are all part of the role of the executor. I did also want to flag that there are a number of government entities that need to be contacted to be advised of the death of a loved one. And so in some cases, the vital statistics agencies in a number of provinces will actually take care of that for you. They'll contact Service Canada. But I would also encourage you to reflect on opportunities around some of the personal belongings of your loved one. I know that going through some of those personal belongings can be very challenging, and different people process things differently. I had a friend who lost his brother over Christmas, and he and his brother's children went through his belongings very quickly, whereas others aren't ready to part with some of the belongings. So again, recognizing your emotions, your readiness to deal with some of the tasks that lie before you. When you are ready, I would encourage you to think about some of the charities that you may be able to donate some of the belongings to, whether it's Big Brothers and Big Sisters, Habitat for Humanity, or some of the other charity thrift stores that may be in your city. We've talked about a number of challenging things. And I guess as our time comes to a close, or at least the presentation part of the time, there are a couple of closing thoughts that I wanted to leave with you. The photo that you see on this slide is a photo of the sunrise at Quadra Island, and that's where I wrote my book. It's where I took a lot of time to reflect on my journey walking alongside my mother. And one of the things that the sunrise reminded me is that there is always a new day, even after the death of a loved one. That end-of-life journey is a natural part of life, even though it can be very challenging. I wanted to remind you again of the quote that I referenced at the beginning of our time together. Time is the most valuable thing a man can spend. Again, that concept of knowing what's important to you and doing it right now. You, as a caregiver, have a really important role to play. And there are resources that are available to support you in that role. And I'm going to flag a couple of resources for you in just a moment. Before I do that, I did want to just say a special thanks to Janet for her help in making the presentation this evening so easy to prepare for. I wanted to thank Boland Books and Monroe Books, who've been big supporters from the very beginning, and also Victoria Hospice and the Lodges of the BC Cancer Agency, who are both sharing my book with their patients. For that, I am honored and grateful. Some of the resources I wanted to leave with you. The link that you'll see on slide number 19, the first one is that advanced care planning book put out by the Ministry of Health. I would really encourage you to check out the resources that they have online, and again, the one guide in particular called My Voice. BC Hospice Societies, the vision of the Hospice Palliative Care Association in particular really grabbed me, and so I wanted to read it for you. Their vision is, we all deserve to live, love, die, and say goodbye in our own way. So they also have a great collection of online resources. The Organ Donor Registry that I mentioned, Transplant BC, walks you through the process of organ donation. And then finally, the Canadian Virtual Hospice. They have a wealth of information online, and I know the family caregivers, I think, have featured some of their resources before. End-of-life care, loss and grief, articles, and lots of questions and answers. So the final slide in the presentation is my contact information. If you're interested in hearing or learning more about me or my book, Someone I Love Is Dying, please check out my website, heartandhandbooks.com. And at this point, I'll turn it over to Janet. But again, just a big thank you to Janet McLean and the family caregivers for the opportunity to talk with you this evening.
There are no other questions, Jean. I just want to thank you so much for your time and for the great presentation, and to all of you for attending the webinar tonight. It's been terrific. It has been recorded, so this webinar will be posted